I mean, it's been interesting to see what's happened with sex over the course of my lifetime. I mean, in the 60s, there was this idea, and it was probably the consequence of the birth control pill, that, well, maybe sex is free, right? It's free and easy because, well, now pregnancy wasn't necessarily a consequence, and venereal disease was reasonably well under control, and so wasn't a blatant threat, certainly not a fatal one. And so people thought, well, why not free love? Well, I think the reason for that is it's complete rubbish. There's no free sex. It's too dangerous. And so what's happened is that
from an emotional standpoint, are you speaking about from an emotional standpoint or physically?
Physically and socially. Well, think of consent. Okay, when can you give consent? Well, the answer is we don't know. No, under what conditions? Well, what constitutes consent? Exactly. A whim? Yes. What if you change your mind? What if you're intoxicated? What if you're stoned? What if you're upset? What if you feel you've been manipulated? You know, I mean, because the issue of consent is not, if the act is serious, and you can debate about whether or not that is, and people have their differences of opinion, certainly emotionally significant in all likelihood. So if it's significant, well, then consent is important. Well, what constitutes consent? Well, marriage does. So that's where sex was encapsulated fundamentally, because the consent was never an issue. I mean, there's all sorts of things that weren't an issue because of that. And it wasn't like it was a magical solution to everything, but
people hook up when they're drunk, people hook up when they're high. And if woman chooses to change her mind, then that spells disaster for men. So that's definitely a big consideration. How do you even supposed to get consent? To his point, it's not like, you know, most of the time it's implied consent. It's not like you asking somebody, are you sure you're going to have sex with me? Or do I have your consent? People don't do that, because I feel like if you're going to ask somebody, do I have your consent to have sex with me? People might look at you weird. Women might look at you like, what's wrong with you? Obviously, I'm here with you. I'm responding on your advances. If you take it a step further and say, do I have your consent? May I make a video as a proof? You probably will be just discarded at that point. It's a legitimate thing to consider for a lot of us guys.
And then the reaction on campuses is, well, what constitutes consent? And the reason that has become questionable is because it's questionable, unless it's not serious. But, you know, I don't think that people really believe that. So they might wish they believed it. But there's plenty of emotional damage done as a consequence of too quick intimacy. I think that's generally the case, because in a partnership that becomes intimate, there's usually one person who's more emotionally invested than the other.
Probably
almost inevitably, yes.
I mean, I think inevitably in every situation.
Well, pretty much, yeah, pretty much.
They can still be very high, but someone's still going to be more than the other.
I can't think of barely any situation in my life where it was 50-50. There is always someone who is a little bit more emotionally involved than the other person. I think you can be lucky if you found a situation when you really like another person, and when you are within maybe 10%, however you would choose to measure it. If you close, if you both present, if you both really care about each other, if you both putting effort, right? There is definitely signs. But more often than not, there is a gap. There's just the unfortunate reality of life that one party is a little bit more emotionally involved than the other party.
So this kind of leads to the conversation about individuality being the way out of ideological traps. And the question is, how and what are the ways to know who you are? Because I don't think it's as easy as it sounds. Like, who are you? It's
impossible. People are really complicated. You're way more complicated than anything else except another person, right? You're the most complicated thing that exists.
Then put two complicated people together and.
Yeah, well, you know, hopefully they can help each other sort themselves out, at least to some degree. But yeah, I mean, to be self-aware completely is just not possible, because, you know, what we try to do to understand ourselves is limit what we'll do. And you do that to other people too. Say, well, I know you, and then you punish them if they do things you don't understand. That way they stay in the box you put them in. And there's downside to that and an upside. It's part of the social contract not to do outrageous things, although you could. So we all abide by these rules, and that simplifies us a lot. Mm-hmm. Right. That's part of being polite, is you don't want the bank teller to be complex. You want them to be polite and simple. Mm-hmm. So your limited understanding is sufficient. And we do that with each other all the time, except when we're emotional.
I think there's something to be said about simplicity. I'm a big fan of it. And I think in the relationship, simplicity actually plays a big role.
How do you find the individuality, your uniqueness, your specialness?
Well, that probably manifests itself to a large degree in what you're interested in.
Which is difficult to know. I think that's also difficult to know. I felt like it took into my mid-30s before I'm like, oh yeah, I'm really interested in these things.
Mm-hmm. Were you interested in all sorts of things?
Sure. Yeah. When I was young, I did all sports. I, then was a teenager, but it wasn't until I was really in my 30s that I really realized how much I enjoyed art, how much I enjoyed, creating and artistic things, how much I enjoyed nature, how much I enjoyed traveling in alone time, because I'm a bit of an introvert. So it wasn't until I was in my mid-30s till I figured that out. So to me, that creates some of my individuality. That's who I am. But how do people figure that out so that they know who they are, so they don't fall into ideological traps?
Well, so the first question is knowing yourself the way out of an ideological trap? Well, it is to some degree, because one size doesn't fit all, right? So you have to be aware of how you differ. Mm-hmm. And that does take a long time to figure out who you are, because you're complicated. Mm-hmm. So it might not be that surprising at all that it took you till your mid-30s before you started to have some sense of who you really were, because people are very hard to understand. And we don't have a good vocabulary, generally speaking, for analyzing differences in people. I mean, the personality test I described is a step in that direction, but it's that lexicon, that vocabulary still isn't popularly established, let's say.
Something to be said about self-awareness. Admitting your mistakes or admitting your shortcomings is not something that, generally speaking, humans are good at, because it hurts. Psychologically, mentally speaking, emotionally speaking, those things not easy to swallow. When you look at yourself and you start noticing shortcomings, it means that you better make a change. And change comes at a cost. Change is a stress. Brain always tries to get away from stress and maximize pleasure. How much bias can you actually overcome, your own bias? Because the truth will land somewhere in between how you perceive yourself and how world perceives you. Now, listen, if 90% of people perceive you as an evil person, then there's something to it. Then I think you really have to pay attention. The metrics by which world will perceive you matters. If every relationship that you have had ended with breakup, and your partner is telling you that you are not a good partner, and you've dated like 20 people, then you probably should think about why in the world every person breaks up with you.
I produce this other technology at Self-Authoring that helps people write about their past, analyze their faults and their virtues, and write a plan for the future. It's a useful way of figuring out who you are. You kind of have to hit yourself against the world, but you tell the story about your past, and that helps you understand where you came from. You figure out your virtues and your faults. That sort of helps you understand your strengths and weaknesses. And then a plan gives you a course for the future. It's hard to do all that writing, but it's hard to blunder through life too without a plan. So it's hard either way.
Pick your hard. You always talk about that. Choose the difficult, or the difficult will choose you eventually, and you might not like it as much, right?
Yeah, well, when it's necessary. Like, I wouldn't say to go out of your way necessarily to make your life difficult, but if you have a difficult choice in front of you, and it's either abandon what you should be doing or do the difficult thing, well, you're going to pay a price for abandonment. So, and I guess I would also say that to understand yourself, it's quite useful to try to not lie, because you tangle yourself up in your own lies. People think they can get away with lying, but you can't get away with falsifying the structure of the world.
Good talk. Self-awareness, definitely a tough subject. Being able to change the course of your life is a very difficult thing to do. It takes an enormous amount of humility, and it takes an enormous amount of effort. We are creatures of habit. And so it's like breaking this habit, admitting that you were wrong for some time. It's very daunting. Not everyone can do it. That's why when it comes to self-awareness and self-improvement, it's probably one of the most humbling thing anyone can do in the world. At the same time, it's probably one of the most difficult things anyone can do in the world, because you can just pay attention how simple it is to give advice. But when it comes to the same advice to yourself or how to adjust your behavior, things get really complicated, because now all of a sudden your life is going to be impacted. Thank you for watching this video until the end. Be sure to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to receive notifications for all the future videos and live shows. That's all for now, my friends. Have a great day.